Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Kaza with Everbridge and welcome to the webinar today. This is part one of our three-part series on active shooter preparedness. If you haven't registered for part two or part three, we will let you know how to do so at the end of the session today. I do have a little housekeeping before we begin. We will be recording the session and making it available on demand after today. The slides will also be available for download. You will get an email within 24 hours with the recording and slides. Also, we'll be accepting audience questions and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end of the session. So please feel free to submit your questions as you think of them. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll be sure to have someone follow up with you directly. All right, so today I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Steve Cremando. Steve Cremando is the founder and principal of Behavioral Science Applications and the director of the Homeland Security Human Factors Institute. He is an internationally known consultant and educator focused on the human element in security, emergency management, and business continuity. Mr. Cremando is a certified threat manager by the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals and a certified master trainer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security National Threat Evaluation and Reporting Program. With more than 30 years of frontline field experience, Mr. Cremando was deployed to the 9/11 and 1993 World Trade Center attacks, the Northeast Anthrax Screening Center, and many other acts of terrorism and mass violence. All right, Steve, let's jump into the presentation. Please take it away.
Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks everyone for making the time to be part of this program today. This year in particular, and of course over the last several months, our national focus has been largely on the number of mass shooting attacks, active shooter sort of scenarios that we've had. So very timely information. I'm going to use the beginning of the program to catch us all up a little bit on where we are in terms of the threat landscape, and then begin applying a specific model towards preparedness. Real quick, and we start talking about this, it's pretty obvious, I think, to all of us that there will be a next attack. The question, of course, is where and when, and also how prepared we are for that next attack. But it's kind of a foregone conclusion, I hate to say, that this is not all over and there will be more. What we know about these attacks is the attacker, the assailant, and we'll be kind of interchangeably be using the term active shooter and active assailant to speak about a wide variety of different sorts of attack methods throughout this program, is typically has begun their planning long in advance of the actual attack, in many instances, months or years. We also know that because of the way these attacks are conducted, the impact of them lasts for years, if not decades, perhaps a lifetime after the event. So for our purposes today, the concept of preparedness will not be isolated to the 5 minutes of terror. And what we mean by that is that most recent FBI reports tell us that most of these attacks begin and end within 5 minutes. Now, understandably, nationally and internationally over the last decade or so, we've drawn a lot of our attention to focus on, really the survival during those 5 minutes of the attack, whether it's run, hide, fight, Alice alert, other sorts of models. Regardless, we obviously do need to prepare people to survive an attack. But we're going to think about this incident as having a much more comprehensive lifespan, beginning well before that first shot is fired and ending well after the shooter is down or the incident has stopped. If we look at this graphic again, most of my graphics today will be with, from the FBI reports, an organization I work often with, to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We know that, as I said, the shooter typically begins the pathway towards violence long before that first shot, and this creates for us opportunities to intervene. So we're going to be looking at this from a very holistic standpoint. One thing I'd like to talk about in terms of the current threat landscape is kind of where we are, again, from one of the most recent FBI reports, and this is looking at the 2021 numbers. We actually see an increase from year over year, 2021 to 2020, of 52% more active shooter incidents. And if we look at the number from compared to 2017, a 96.8% increase. We've actually doubled this number since really beginning of the decade. And we've seen this constant and fairly steady climb in the number of active shooter cases. So not only is this an ongoing threat, it is unfortunately an increasing threat. Now, as I said, we're going to look at the entire lifespan of the event from a preparedness standpoint. And the model that I've been working with for the last probably 12 years, we've referred to as CASM, Comprehensive Active Shooter Incident Management. And as you can see, quite simply, it is the application of the 4 classic phases of emergency management to the problem of active shooter or active assailant. Now, we're going to go beyond this a little bit in our presentation today, and I have a lot of content to share with you. And as Jocelyn said, we're going to try to budget kind of 10 minutes towards the end of the program for questions and discussion. But you'll notice as we move around this, I'm going to isolate on 3 of the 4 quadrants today, and that's going to be on preparedness, response, and recovery. And we're going to go beyond the bullet items that are, really displayed here in this graphic to think about some newer approaches and some really ways to kind of mature your plans. Now, I'm going to use that term several times because it's a bit of an assumption that your organization, your community has a level of readiness for active shooter. I think most do have awareness and some level of readiness. Our goal today is to up your game. Our goal is to continue to build capacity, make your plans, your policies, procedures, even your exercises that more realistic. I am by training a behavioral scientist. So much of the way I approach this program and these concepts will be through the lens of human behavior and what we could do to really enhance human performance in the before, the during, and the after these events to make us that much more ready and robust for this kind of situation. So, landscape, where are we now? As I said, we have an increasing number of these events, and it seemed to us over the summer and throughout the spring, increased frequency of these events as well. When we look at active shooter events, the research tells us very clearly, again, we're looking at the FBI pre-attack behavior study in 2018, that the leading stressor identified in these situations are mental health stressors. Now, I want to be super clear with the entire audience from the onset of this. This should not be confused with the idea that individuals with a mental illness are any more likely to be violent than the average person. All of the research in this area consistently tells us that people with mental illnesses are no more likely to be violent. In fact, they're more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. So we have to make that separation. But things are changing very dramatically on the mental health landscape. If I had this discussion with you in 2019, what I would be saying to you at this very moment is the prevalence of mental illness in the United States is about 1 out of 5 Americans. It is 18.6%. Today, after and through these current phases of the pandemic, according to Johns Hopkins, the number is 1 out of 4 Americans. It has gone to 26.6%. What this means is whether people are actually have diagnosis, assessments, or in treatment, we have more people who are actually seeming to meet the criteria for mental health disorders. More people are struggling with their mental health. This is not causal, but this is a contributing factor. And SAMHSA, here in the United States, the U.S. Through U.S. Health and Human Services, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration tells us that mental health disorders and substance abuse disorders will soon surpass all other forms of disability worldwide. So when we look at the intersection of these mental health challenges as a contributing factor to active shooters, we know that that is on the rise as well. So these are very important for us to think about when we understand the whole picture. So for our purposes today, the launch pad and for preparedness for me, speaking about this from a behavioral standpoint, is Lewin's equation. Dr. Kurt Lewin, often thought to be the father of social psychology, had famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between a person and their environment. So I want you to think about the environment right now. And I'm not speaking just about the ecological environment or climate and such, although that is certainly a factor. It is what else is going on in people's lives. It is the residual effects and ongoing effects of the pandemic. Different parts of the country, different parts of the world struggling with that. And for some people, adding additional concerns of risks like monkeypox even. The ongoing military conflict in Ukraine. The economic instability, inflation, oil and gas prices, political tensions, and as I said, more what seems to be more climate-fueled sort of crises around the world. All of these things and more are going on with any one individual, any one community, any one organization. So when we think about this interaction of the person and the environment, it is actually very complex right now, probably more complex than we've seen. And periodically, the American Psychological Association publishes a national survey that's known as the Stress in America survey. When it was published several weeks ago, the findings were essentially 7 out of 10 US adults feels that they are overwhelmed by the cascading and ongoing number of crises facing the world right now. And if we look at the graphic on the right, the darker one, we see nearly 80 to 90% of people reporting these specific items: gas prices and uncertainty, challenges with the military invasion from Russia, all of these things going on. So as we think about how this relates to active shooter, we understand that correlation, that stress and mental health stress are very significant contributing factors. This is all important for us in the preparedness phase, understanding where people are at, what people's mindsets are, what their stress level is. And this is not likely to go away anytime soon. The Public Health Service, and specifically the Mental Health Service in the UK, the Center for Mental Health, has been doing some really good work kind of forecasting what the mental health picture will look like in the post-pandemic era. And they're suggesting that whenever the pandemic seems to abate, meaning the disease itself, the mental health consequences actually just begin to tick up. And what they're anticipating in the 3 to 5 years post-pandemic is the demand for mental health services is likely to exceed available capacity by 2 to 3 times. What this means in very simple language, there will be many more people struggling with mental health issues than can find available services. So we're in a really interesting place when we start to think about psychology and human behavior and the sort of stresses that for some people do put them potentially on a pathway towards mass violence. The other thing we know, and this is not my place to critique or analyze the veracity of these ideas, is that when we are in periods that are characterized by uncertainty, we have a likelihood of more conspiracy theories. You may look at some of the things you hear and you see, and to you, they may not seem like conspiracy theories. They may seem like they're grounded in your same ideas, and that's fine. But the point about this is when we do have times of more conspiracy, conspiracies usually have 2 critical factors for us. One is they're usually anchored around some sort of grievance. Someone is doing something wrong, they need to be stopped. And the other is an aspect of paranoia, that this is being done in some covert way, that it's out of our control and we're trying, people are trying to get over on us in some way. Paranoia is also another recognized contributor towards violence, another risk indicator. Both of these together have the potential to put more people for different reasons onto a potential pathway towards violence. So right now, in terms of understanding our threat landscape, we need to take a very balanced look at your situation, your organization, your community, for both insider threats and outsider threats. That could be a current employee who harbors some of these thoughts and feelings or maybe struggling with stress in their mental health, the person who is in the workplace struggling with situations of domestic or intimate partner violence in their home that might follow them into workplace. That's significant right now because we know domestic violence, while people were on lockdown and in the pandemic era, increased. That means the potential to follow us to the workplace increases as well. And we actually may have in our workforce ideological sympathizers to any of the causes that may espouse violence right now, or be again anchored in this idea that violence is necessary to either advance or to defend their cause or their belief. From the outside, that same ideological violence may be targeted against you or your organization for what you do or what you represent. That may come as an outsider threat from a former employee or customer or client, or it could come to your facilities and your campus, even your community, in the way of a true active shooter or a classic active shooter scenario that is characterized by random target selection, where the shooter is purely just looking for numbers, looking for a high casualty count. All of these are possible in our current environment. But what else is possible is to manage this operational risk of violence. And we're going to talk about that strategy in kind of section 2 in a few moments. When we think about understanding how violence arises, and I'm giving you some of the backstory now, and then how we assess factors about the individual of concern, their target, and the situation we find ourselves in that gives us opportunity for intervention. We can manage this risk, we can intervene if we do this in a holistic way. But your management, your reduction of the likelihood of violence can't be just anchored in preparing and exercising around the actual window from shots fired to shooter down, that 5 minutes of terror I mentioned. We have to try to apply a more holistic approach. And that's the idea of these 4 different quadrants. So let's talk about what preparedness means. Now, remember, you're getting a copy of these slides. You'll have access to a link to this recording at some point. I know I'm going pretty quickly and I know there's a lot of content, but you'll be able to cycle back and look at that graphic if you like and how I populated those 4 different quadrants with some ideas. But I want to go beyond that. I want to talk about other ideas now in preparedness because this is our greatest window of opportunity. You're all familiar, at least most, with the idea of being left of bang. We want to get ahead of the curve because by the time the first shot is fired, it's too late. We're already just thrust into survival mode and our options become very, very limited. We want to give ourselves the greatest range of options in preventing violence by trying to get ahead of the curve, and that means identifying pre-incident behavior that tells us someone inside or outside the organization may be on a pathway towards violence. Remembering that violence is a process, it is not an event. When we talk about this kind of violence, and I'll be more clear in a moment, this is not about someone who snaps. Now, it could look like that on the surface. You're all familiar with the idea or the expression about the straw that breaks the camel's back. Something can be building for a long time and get to that tipping point, but it means that other things are going on for a long period of time, moving someone towards this. And ultimately, the individual makes a decision that the best way to address their grievance, their stress, their sense of being victimized themselves is through violence. It's a decision. This sort of violence, which today is referred to primarily as targeted violence, is a form of predatory violence. This is different. You see me using 2 terms here. Some of you may be familiar. The first is affective violence, and affective violence is reactive. It's in the moment. This is something like road rage, in which a person just loses control. Not a lot of pre-incident indicators. They're responding in the moment to a perceived threat, like someone cut me off on the road, and it's very much physiologically based on our fight and flight sort of response. That is not an active shooter or active assailant scenario. Active shooter events are predatory, targeted violence in which they're premeditated, and we don't see this autonomic system arousal. What does that mean? When we have an instance of road rage and a person is losing control, you could see this even physiologically. Perhaps depending on their skin tone, their coloration, they're redder, their veins are bulging in their neck, they're yelling and screaming, they're shouting, they've lost it, and you see all this physiological activation. When we look at active shooters, whether it's closed circuit television, it's videos they're taking and streaming themselves, it is reports from eyewitness, these individuals are cool and collected and methodical, and there's no display of this autonomic arousal, this physiological arousal. This is someone taking control as opposed to someone losing control. Now, again, when we think about targeted violence, it is not necessarily a really narrow target when we use that term. It can be very specific. The individual who walks into the hospital or medical clinic looking for the doctor, the nurse, and the medical team who they feel has harmed them and only wants to hurt those people. It could be the school setting in which an individual walks in and has certain people, bullies or otherwise in their mind, who they are targeting, and maybe other people get caught up in the crossfire. And then there is, of course, the random target selection. But the person has selected a place. It's still targeted in that way. It's the shopping center. It's the concert hall. It's wherever that violence happens. But the person who's involved in predatory violence moves along what is today known the dominant model of threat assessment, as the pathway to violence. And we'll spend some time on that in just a moment. Now, again, this is from the Violence Project. The Violence Project was, again, funded by the U.S. Department of Justice and the National Institute of Justice. A very good study, which I'll refer to once or twice this afternoon, looking at commonalities among shooters. And here, probably what's very interesting to us are the motives for people. People obviously can have more than one motive, but we look at some of the motives, and they are, again, in the workplace, employment issues, in the schoolyard, academic and interpersonal issues, economic issues. And then you see different ideologies. You see misogyny, you see religious and ethnic hate, you see homophobic and transphobic sorts of issues. But you also see issues like notoriety, like fame seeking, and you see other relationship problems. What you get out of this is it's a mixed bag. And because of that, it tells us that we need to be looking at this problem holistically at how people are doing in their lives and the things they're struggling with, because it may not just be the workplace issue, it might not just be the schoolyard issue, it could be a range of different issues combined. But to my earlier point, violence is a process, not an event, and that is good news. Because it means a person is moving over time towards violence, it offers opportunities for intervention. It can be turned back. Violence of this type arises from a smoldering crisis, something that's going on for a while, not a sudden crisis in most issues. And we're looking at a very large, kind of, and ever growing data set and research in this area. Some of the research, and this again, this first bullet point comes again from the FBI pre-attack behavior study, was active shooters typically have displayed 4 to 5 observable concerning behaviors in the days, weeks, and months leading up to these events. The problem we continually face is that these happen in silos. The people making these observations may not be aware of the significance of them, don't react to them, don't report them. And again, because they're observed in silos, people are not, the classic example or term of connecting the dots, fully realized until after the fact. How many times in the days after a mass shooting do we start to see the newspaper stories and the online stories that everybody saw these warning signs? The challenge is getting ahead of that curve and understanding when those signs are actually, behavioral risk indicators that are placing someone on this classic pathway to violence. Now, we're going to speak about the pathway to violence once or twice more as we kind of move through this presentation and then on to response and recovery. But we know that the bar is pretty low. Think about how many people in your world today have a grievance, and that may even involve you. The good news is most people with a grievance aren't going to go too much further than to, stew about it, maybe complain about it. But some people will. A subset will go on to start forming violent ideations, fantasizing why I ought to get that person, I ought to take care of business and do this or that thing. So people start to, again, develop a mental idea about how to take action. A smaller subset yet goes further and starts to get involved in research and planning. How can I conduct this attack? For some people, that's satisfying unto itself. They're just playing this out mentally, but some people will go beyond and start moving into these pre-operational, pre-attack modes where they're moving towards this. Now, about this model, which goes way back to 2003 from Calhoun and Weston, please know it does not have to be linear and sequential. People can move up and down, and people could jump over steps. These are more about milestones on the way to an attack, but they tell us 3 important things. Is someone on the pathway, where they are in the pathway relative to the end point, and are they potentially accelerating towards that based on these ideas? Now, when we think about preparedness, and this is not part of the original graphic I showed you, I mentioned I'm going to talk about some other ideas beyond just what were on that graphic, meaning the 4 phases of emergency management graphic. One of the best things that we could be doing today in our organizations for preparedness is starting to create an upstander culture. The upstander culture, and here I'm drawing on a great document I would recommend to everyone in our audience today. The document is called Making Preparedness a Reality, published 2018, again by the FBI, has some language in there that talks about the transition from bystanders who simply observe to upstanders who recognize and report and in some instances intervene. But bystanders, even unto themselves, are a force multiplier. They're the eyes and ears. And typically, if we're talking about school violence or we're speaking about workplace violence, it is a fellow student or a coworker who knows first, who sees and hears behaviors of concern, but often is not sure what to do about it. By converting your organization culturally, slowly making the change, that people, everyone has a shared obligation in our safety and survival with this sort of problem. We need bystanders to act as upstanders, step forward, recognize and report when they see this. This means, again, going beyond the basics. Now, when we think about ASIS International, we think about the ANSI National Standard in Workplace Violence Prevention and Intervention, even some of the language in OSHA and other regulators, we understand the recommendations for providing employee training. At a minimum, employee training about violence prevention, workplace, school, whatever it is, starting with some real basics, the types and sources of violence, what your organization's violence-related policies and procedures are, recognizing behavioral indicators, knowing how to report, who to go to, how it's going to happen, and if something goes down, shots are fired, there's some sort of attack, what they should do to make themselves safe to increase survivability. As I said, today we're not going to focus on one particular model of that, but it's important they have that in mind. And even if you're not doing live drills and exercises around that sort of preparedness, there's a tremendous and a demonstrable benefit to mental rehearsal, to having people mentally walk through and talk through, what would I do if shots were fired in my place, my workplace, my community, this movie theater, that restaurant, to play the what if game and be in a high level of mental awareness for this. Now, as I said, one of the elements of preparedness that's advocated even within the national standard for prevention and intervention is the need to develop a threat assessment team. Very often today, these are increasingly referred to as BTAM, Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management Teams. And we actually, in a moment, will look at some, upcoming legislation around this nationally and locally that's driving communities, schools, organizations towards this. But this is actually part of the national standard, this idea that if you're going to tell employees, please try to recognize these indicators, report them. We need a way to capture those reports. They have to go somewhere. And we need people trained to act on those reports, people who are trained in a methodology that's sound, that's grounded in empirical evidence, that's defensible in a courtroom of how we're going to determine the level of concern. Now, whether we have a person of concern, we know this is party A has threatened party B, or maybe it's even an anonymous communication. It's a letter, it's a phone call, it's a text message, it's some sort of threatening communication. How do we capture that? How do we assess the level of concern? And the level of concern, of course, then informs our decisions about what to do. That's threat management. Threat assessment, do we have a problem? How big and bad is it? Threat management, what should we do about it? So threat assessment in today's language really is this systematic, fact-based method of investigating, examining, and assessing the level of concern. And we're looking big picture. We're looking at the subject, our person of concern or person of interest. We're looking at their potential targets. What is it about the target? How vulnerable are they? What kind of trigger events may put this whole threat into overdrive and make it an imminent risk? And what is it in our environment, the workplace, the school, our community, things that we might be able to influence that are potentially increasing, and we may actually influence to decrease the risk of violence. Now, again, we're still in the kind of sphere of preparedness. I wanted to talk to you about where we are today. And I mentioned earlier the Violence Project funded by the Department of Justice and their study published now just a few years ago that spoke about commonalities. What we know is, it seems sometimes that there's a lot of similarities between the shooters that we hear about, that there still is not a useful profile. When we use profiling in this way, first of all, it gets us on the wrong side of the argument, and it lends for all kinds of potential pushback that we're bringing different biases in and so forth. We really want to be anchored in behavior and communication. But the other thing that's a problem with profiling is in threat assessment, profiling produces for us way too many false positives to be useful. Those false positives mean that we're going to see too many people as potentially being violent actors when in fact they're unlikely to be violent at all. What is useful though are commonalities. So I want to share 4, and these are not just specific to school, workplace, other places as well. The 4 commonalities that have an empirical basis at this point is the vast majority of these shooters have childhood, what we'll call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, whether it's trauma, exposure to violence, neglect, abuse, or parental suicide, all of these different sorts of things or combinations, there is some history of this exposure to violence and trauma. The second is every shooter, mass shooter, has studied mass shooters. We see this over and over again. Many of these folks do writing. Sometimes that writing is referred to as a manifesto. There's an increasing movement and idea of people not to refer to these as manifestos because there's usually not a coherent sort of political or ideological strategy to many of them. But people communicate, and that communication very often is through leakage, people who just begin to tell others about what they're thinking and planning to do study other shooters. And in these documents very often articulate, I'm going to outdo the last one. I've studied that school shooting. I studied the shooting at the mosque in New Zealand. I studied the shooting at this campus, and I'm going to improve on the tactical plan, and I'm actually going to do better. And what we see are many copycat scenarios in which people are now emulating each other. I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. It's something that's becoming very important to us. The third and fourth, the third is that shooters, again, are studied with other shooters. Let's go back for one moment. Other shooters, as I said, studying other shooters hit some sort of tipping point. I don't want to miss over that. I got a little bit ahead of myself. Other shooters, again, tend to hit a tipping point and begin to communicate about their intent towards violence to self, others, or both. Other shooters, as I just spoke about, study the other shooters and seek very often to outdo them. But fourth, obviously, shooters have access to the means, access to weapons. Now, this is different in other forms of violent crime. In active shooter cases, most of the weapons used tend to be legally owned weapons if it's an adult shooter. If it is a school shooter, someone underage, it tends to be a weapon, again, legally owned, but by a parent, by a relative, by a neighbor, someone where they could access and get their hands on these weapons. When we look at street crime, most of the crime committed in other sorts of street level violence tends to be committed with illegal weapons, but that is not the case in most instances of active shooter cases. So I spoke a moment ago about, and I got a little ahead of myself there because this is an important component, the idea of shooters studying shooters. And many of you, again, are intimately familiar, of course, with the Columbine effect and just how many copycat attacks have been inspired. But the most important thing that comes out of Columbine is not just the inspiration, it's that created what is referred to as a cultural script. And you'll remember this going back to the Columbine era, that the school shooter was that person perhaps wearing the long black trench coat in school, who was presenting themselves as the victim, this outcast, who was writing these online manifestos and so forth, but who saw themselves as these victims. And they created somewhat of an aesthetic, kind of a look and a feel of what it meant like. And there were many copycats, or at least attempts, around the country over the decades moving forward from this. But what we've matured into today is aesthetics over ideology. And what we've seen a few times this summer, whether it was in Highland Park at the 4th of July parade, whether it's in our school shooting in Texas and others, is that this has become, for some individuals, an identification, a method of self-identification. The Texas shooter, other people were referring to him before the fact as his nickname was the school shooter. If we look at the shooter in Parkland, Florida, who gets online and posts YouTube videos and says very clearly, I'm going to be the next school shooter. These individuals begin to take on a mass shooter identity, look the part, dress the part, get online and participate in online forums where they're doing the same sort of behavior. animations of their attacks, videos, song lyrics, cartoons, memes. Again, primarily younger men in this aesthetic, who again start spending tremendous money and energy in looking the part, getting the gear, even if it's not the smartest gear, even if it's not the most efficient gear. This graphic to the right of the screen is all of the kit, all of the gear worn by the shooter in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting back in 2012. This is a college student who was struggling financially and little by little purchased all of this tactical gear, all of these weapons, all this ammunition, spent so much time at the range preparing, dedicated himself to being this person. And we see this in the online environment, usually in the darker corners of the internet today, where there is a pool of people who prompt each other, who egg each other on, who they're posing for, that I'm going to be the next school shooter. And it has become, as I said, not based in an ideology, perhaps. If it was, maybe this black pill worldview, if you're not familiar, that kind of comes from the Matrix movie franchise, this idea of red pills, blue pills, black pills. The black pill is this fatalistic, nihilistic, no point in living sort of outlook that these people have taken on. So we see this becoming much more prevalent now. And there's a lot that we can kind of talk about, why? Why is this happening in this moment in history? Is it the isolation that some of these younger people went through during COVID? Is it changes in societal structure? Is it people spending more screen time? I don't know. It's not my place to really solve that problem. But we need to understand the landscape as it changes so we could tune into these risk indicators, identify pre-incident, stop this from happening. What else do we do to mature our plan? What else do we do in terms of a global preparedness in our organization for this, not just preparing for the moment of terror? It's thinking about the response phase. And for us, very quickly, it's going to be the discussion of these three quadrants, not simply run, hide, fight. Stopping the killing, stopping the dying, and stopping the crying. And I want to be real clear about what I mean by stopping the crying when we get there. It is not simply that people should not be emotionally overwhelmed. Obviously, they're likely to be victims or witnesses of something highly traumatic. That is not what we mean, and I'll clarify that in just a moment. Whatever model you select, make sure that it is widely dispersed and brought into your culture. It's socialized into your culture. It's trained. It's reminded, consistently to people that it becomes sticky for them and they understand. Because under stress, we know the effects of stress on decision making, problem solving, logic, judgment, reasoning, and so forth. People are not going to rise to the occasion. They're going to fall to their training. Now, there is lots of discussion about the potential traumatic nature of doing some drills and exercises at the most high level. We're not going there exactly today. Whatever it is you decide on in terms of a model and how to train people, do it, be serious about it, be consistent about it, because some of this training may have a short shelf life if people are not reminded about these concepts. But remembering again that the incident does not necessarily end with shooter down, we need to think about what's next. You've run, you've hid, you've fought, you've hopefully survived the situation. What else is going on in the response phase? Well, one of the concepts we're always aware about is the response gap. The response gap is the gap between the time shots are fired and the first incoming law enforcement and EMS personnel. And we always go back to the idea that incoming law enforcement typically is not trained to stop and assist the wounded. They're going to move past the wounded and continue to move towards the threat to neutralize the threat. So in this model, we understand that first hands-on by EMS is going to be critical in survivability, especially when we look at some of the weapons being used in these scenarios and the capacity for very serious wounds. What we know is the most common and most preventable form of death in active shooter events is people bleeding out, and people can bleed out very quickly. We're talking about just a few moments. So it's critical in your organization in this response phase, not just to be able to run, hide, and fight, but to also stop the dying. There are great national campaigns, right? And most of these trainings are free in your community. Stop the bleed until help arrives. Ways that people can learn the basics of bleeding control, very often referred to simply as BCON. by applying pressure, applying tourniquets, how to help someone survive until EMS arrives and we get people to a higher level of care. This may also mean having the right materials around for people, like a trauma kit. However that's positioned, wherever those are positioned in your organization, where people have access to bandages, to tourniquets, to other materials that will help people stop the bleed. This is critical. And then, as I said, I want to be clear on stopping the crying. Once again, this is not to suggest that people don't have the right or should be constrained in their right to emotionally respond to these events. They need to, and they will, because these are so powerful. But, and this photograph is taken from the Run, Hide, Fight video produced by the Houston Mayor's Office and funded by Homeland Security. You may remember, if you've ever seen or you go on to see this video, the woman in the red sweater having a meltdown in the break room where herself and her colleagues are trying to hide from a shooter. She's going to give away their position. She's going to make a bad situation worse. What do we do with people in the 0 to 48 hours, the immediate wake of this event, to help them really, again, respond in a way that's not going to make a bad thing worse? The recommendation here is psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is the intervention of choice. It's actually a model that's promoted and trained through Homeland Security and FEMA and SAMHSA as the model for the 0 to 48 hours. 0 means now, immediately in the threat environment, not hours later, not days later. We can initiate that now. Even we can provide psychological first aid while we're hands-on assisting and providing medical care for people. Limits distress and negative behavior that can further increase further fear and arousal that becomes that emotional spiral. This is what we could do to reassure this person, help calm this person, help this person reel it in so we all get through this alive. Important distinction, there's a lot of free mental health first aid training available. It's great stuff, but that's not what I'm speaking about. Mental health first aid is intended for an individual who has or is developing a diagnosable mental health condition, and they're having a mental health emergency or a psychiatric emergency. So what you learn in mental health first aid class is the major categories of mental illness, the difference between a thought disorder, mood disorder, anxiety disorder, the signs and symptoms of those conditions, and how to help someone in an emergency, mental health emergency, and connect them to the right resources. Psychological first aid is something different. That's what we're advocating in these moments of terror, because as soon as those shots stop and people evacuate, you have to start thinking about what's next. Are you outside your facility now in a family reunification center? And not only do you have highly distressed victims and witnesses to support, you have incoming family members and community members who are pouring into your environment as well. Psychological first aid will be the intervention of choice for that. And there's plenty of sources. That's another model, again, supported through our government disaster and emergency relief organizations. And then continuing this theme of preparedness, how do we prepare for this last phase, which is recovery? Recovery, I would suggest to you, is best thought out about as along a timeline, moving from the 0 moments of shooting out through the first hours, the first day, the first weeks, and beyond. And I'm encouraging you in today's presentation that the post-shooting should not be an afterthought. It needs to be planned and practiced just like the other aspects of your active shooter plan or active assailant plan, which means if you do some kind of drill or exercise, can you add a component, whether it's notional or actual, where you stand up a family unification point for incoming families? Can you practice that and see what the challenges will be? Because that's going to happen. Whether you tell people don't come running to our campus or our corporation, their family members will be running towards them to find out if their loved ones are okay. You have to be in the level of preparedness to catch that. So let's think about mass violence for a moment. What are the things we should understand about this as we prepare for the recovery phase? First of all, the psychological impact of mass violence is different than any other kind of disaster, any other sort of crisis. It is something very unique. And you have to prepare simultaneously for individual trauma and collectively, your business, your school campus, your community. It is not just the impact on those direct victims or witnesses. This casts a very, very wide shadow. And we need to be thinking about who is going to help out and how they're going to help out in the post-incident phase. Now, two things to think about very quickly from the science aspect of this. When we see mass shooting events of this type, the rates of PTSD are much higher. That shouldn't be shocking to you. So you see a number here in the second point, 10 to 36%. How is that significant? When we look at other sorts of disasters, let's say a natural disaster, which is the most prevalent form of disaster, the rates of mental illness, the rates of post-traumatic stress are about 11 to 15%. So this is 2 to 3 times higher. But most important, the last point here, very few people who come out of these scenarios report no symptoms of traumatic stress. Nearly everyone walks out with some sort of profound psychological effect from being in the active shooter environment. So we have to appreciate there's going to be complexities to the post-incident phase because these are just so powerful. The other studies, again, we look at are not about PTSD, but rather ASD, acute stress disorder. And to just clarify the difference, it's about time of onset. PTSD, by its definition, implies a lag. The terrible thing has happened, and it's days, weeks, and sometimes months go by before the onset of trauma reactions or symptoms. With ASD, acute stress disorder, that's the concept that these symptoms or reactions we have can begin immediately after the event. And if you look at the text on this slide, you'll see a mass shooting event produces rates of acute stress disorder that are much higher than nearly every other sort of emergency and crisis that we may be preparing for. So you have to appreciate there are tremendous stresses throughout the entire life cycle of this, but many stresses that are very specific on the post-incident slide. And many of those can have very profound long-term effects. They're going to affect wellness and performance, team cohesion and morale in your organization, your brand, your reputation. It's going to affect everything about your organization. So you do want to think about how we're going to get our arms around these post-incident reactions as a form of preparedness. So we play out the timeline. Where will emotional support and psychological support be necessary? And we can articulate and think about a whole number of different places along the timeline. In the zero moment, we're at the scene of the shooting. In the moments after the shooting has stopped, we have to initially start preparing for the possibility of family reunification center. Depending on the scope and magnitude of the event, we may need to think about standing up a 24-hour-a-day family assistance center for the next several days. Do we need liaison and support to local hospitals who are caring for the wounded? Is there a likelihood that community vigils are going to start tonight with people leaving candles and flowers and flags and teddy bears at the scene of the crime or nearby it? Will there be memorials and funerals over the next several days that again will have a profound emotional impact on our workforce, our families, our communities? And then what additional care is needed for all of those responders and businesses and schools that are affected by this? And that's actually a pretty wide net for us to think about. You do not want to be trying to anticipate this in the wake of an actual shooting event. You do yourself a very significant favor by making this part of your preparedness and thinking it through. So when I think about immediate post-incident needs, for me, this means minutes to hours. Obviously, in the minutes, it's pure survival. It is, liaising with the incoming incident command structure and first responders. It is liaison with the hospitals receiving the wounded. It is thinking from your organizational standpoint about crisis communications, which is the what we say, and the media management, which is how we're going to deal with all the swarms of incoming reporters and media, because that will be happening. And as I said earlier, the provision of psychological first aid and support for the individuals and those families who are now gathering outside your facility very, very quickly. Those are the 0 minutes to the first hours. And then the early stage for me is hours to days. What are the needs there? What will the likely environment involve? It's going to be those vigils, funerals, memorials. It's going to be coordinating for the ongoing investigation and for victim support. It's going to be networking with our first responders and our service providers for emotional support and other ways that we can support victims and their families and witnesses and the whole community who's shaken. And then when we think about mid-phase, to me, this is months up to starting to move towards the 1-year anniversary. This is part of preparedness. A 1-year anniversary will come. You don't want to be thinking about planning for that in the days and weeks before the 1-year anniversary, because it would be very, very significant as a milestone for a community or an organization. You want to do this in a planful way, and you want to do it with the victims and survivors, not to the victims and survivors. You want active participation in thinking that through. This is a very kind of cold-hearted way to say this, but every bullet comes with a lawyer attached. There will be litigation, obviously criminal litigation, and in many instances, potentially civil litigation as well, which means that in the mid-stage, this case is going to be in the news and under discussion very, very prominently. And that is going to kick up a lot of dust for people who were affected. It's going to keep the emotions very raw. Lastly, in this phase, it is a good time in the mid-phase to start doing your after-action reports. If you do these too soon, you may still be somewhat in the fog of war. If you do these too late, you may lose things to memory. In the mid-phase, meaning the weeks to month after the event, a good time to do your after-action report, capture lessons learned, know what's going on, and use those to grow your plan, mature your plans even further. And then the late stage is the 1-year anniversary and beyond. Please appreciate how important that is and how much preparedness you will have to do for your organization, your communities to get ready for that in terms of managing media attention, other sorts of unwanted attention, preparing people, understand the impact on performance in your workplace around that time. There are lots of things you need to start anticipating way before you get to that point on the calendar. Lastly, which is a point I've made throughout this section, the need to connect people with the right sort of behavioral health support. Know that we do have a national distress helpline. Many people have seen over the last weeks the publication of the 988 mental health crisis helpline across the country. That's a wonderful thing for us. That's great when we have concerns about suicide risk or other risks of violence of someone who's in a mental health crisis. 988 is now the number of the land for people in that state of mind. But we actually have other resources like crisis counselors available through SAMHSA and our disaster mental health programs to be able to talk with people, text with people, beginning right at, on scene and beyond. And you have those numbers here on the slide. So let's wrap it up and save a few moments for any possible questions, comments, or discussion. A few things to think about. I focused today in our presentation on the kind of holistic model of looking across the whole timeline, but through the lens of behavior of the attacker, behavior of responders and victims, thinking again about these indicators and how we can mitigate some of those challenges. But as I said, understanding the behavioral health support piece is something we need to anticipate and plan. It can help prevent and create an off-ramp for someone who may be coming onto the pathway of violence if we connect them with the right behavioral health help. And I think I made a pretty strong case about how mental health trends are changing and influencing this landscape. And of course, the post-incident phase in which people again are dealing with the pure raw emotions of having been in harm's way. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to turn this over to Jocelyn for some closing comments. You, of course, through Everbridge and directly to myself, have a way to always get back in touch with me. Questions, comments, research, resources. I am always happy to help out. Jocelyn, I'll turn it over to you for anything else you'd like to share at this portion of the program.
Great, thank you, Steve, and thanks for the presentation. It was super informative today. We have a couple questions that I'll go through really quickly. You mentioned it briefly, but is it known if the recent increase in mental illness is tied to the isolation related to COVID-19?
So that is one of the leading theories. We know there is, and there historically has been really good evidence about kind of negative mental health effects of isolation, however it takes place. And many people through the first phase of COVID and lockdown, were really affected by that. Kids' school years being disrupted, people working from home, et cetera. We believe that is one of several contributing factors, but it's not the only factor. And again, although I pledge to be, as apolitical as possible, when we're in times of real political division, and there's a lot of ideological divides, and people are dealing with that just through angry discourse and sometimes through violence, that kind of split, that kind of really aggressive ideology sometimes can be another contributing factor. It is the economic stresses we've spoken about. It is kind of all of these things. Now, the question is always to what degree? And I would suggest with, whoever asked the question, that isolation from the pandemic might be one of, if not the most significant of all of those combining factors. It is definitely one of it, but to what degree exactly, we don't know yet.
Great, thank you, Steve. Another question, what is your best advice for those beginning to plan crisis communication plans?
So a few things to think about. There is actually some really, really great risk communicators in the country. The one that I turn to very often is Dr. Peter Sandman. And Dr. Sandman on his website, which is just psandman.com, is usually super generous and allowing people to download his different manuals and guides. But to this point, I want to share one concept from Dr. Sandman, which is the more frightening an experience is from a crisis communication standpoint, the more important it is to lead with empathy. So rather than giving people just the facts of the situation, is to start your discussion with, we know this has been incredibly difficult. We know this has been, or we can't even imagine how traumatizing and terrifying the situation has been, but this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing in the post-incident and so forth. So there are some very, very good strategies. I spend some of my time, but not a lot of my time, on the topic of crisis communications, but I would look out and try to find those real experts who are providing roadmaps and guidelines for how to craft crisis communications specific to these sort of events, and they are out there. So take a look around.
Great, thanks, Steve. All right, one last question and then we'll wrap up the webinar today. How can someone get the psychological first aid training that you mentioned?
So there's a few different ways. There's actually an online version of it that's offered by the National Children's Traumatic Stress Network, the NCTSN, and that's at UCLA. You can find this easily online. And although it sounds like it's oriented towards children because it's offered by this organization, this model was developed by UCLA, the National Children's Center, and the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, which is part of the VA system. So it's meant for adult psychological first aid as well. The easiest and most cost-efficient way is to do the online versions, which are very useful. There are loads of psychological first aid instructors in your different communities across the US and worldwide. The best thing to do is reach out to your mental health resources at the county level, the state level, and say who in our state provides psychological first aid. Very often it's the Medical Reserve Corps, it's a CERT team, it is your mental health authorities in your county, your community, or your state. But it is usually available through these kind of governmental sources, local, state, and otherwise. But as I said, you could do it today, and you could probably do it at no cost or for free with the online versions from the National Children's Traumatic Stress Network.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much for your insights, Steve. We are sadly approaching the end of the session today, but as a reminder, if we weren't able to get to your question, we will have someone follow up with you directly. And I got a lot of questions if this session is being recorded, if we're sending out the slides. Yes, the recording and the slides will be emailed to you guys directly within the next 24 hours. Steve, do you mind advancing the slide one?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're
Absolutely.
good. I just want to remind everyone to register for the rest of our active shooter preparedness series. So part 2 will take place next week on August 18th. We'll be talking about how smart technology can assist in active shooter threats. The registration page is linked here within the slides, or you can find it on the Everbridge website. And then next slide, please. Perfect. And then part 3 will take place on August 23rd, and we'll be hearing from Eric Alpertz, who was on the front line at the Pulse nightclub shooting, actually. So again, the registration page is linked here, or you can find it on the Everbridge website. So with that, I want to give a big thanks to our speaker, Steve Cremando. Thank you for all of your very informative information today. And thank you to our audience for taking time out of your busy day to join us. And we hope we can see you at the rest of the Active Shooter series. Have a good one.